Walter Grayson sat at the counter, his shoulders hunched over a steaming cup of black coffee. At 78, he was a fixture here, as much a part of Millie's as the cracked vinyl stools or the jukebox that hadn't worked since '92. His hands, rough as old leather, wrapped around the mug, the faint outline of a Marine Corps tattoo peeking from under his rolled-up sleeve. The ink was faded, blurred by time, but the eagle, globe, and anchor still held their shape, a quiet testament to a life most in Willow Creek had never thought to ask about. His ball cap, emblazoned with USS Intrepid, sat low over eyes that carried a weight no one seemed to notice. The diner was busy this morning, the usual Saturday crowd filling the booths. Families with kids, truckers passing through, and a group of men in their 40s who'd taken over the corner table, their laughter loud and careless. Walter didn't look their way, but he heard them. Everyone did. Their voices carried, sharp and unfiltered, tossing around stories of last night's game and complaints about work. One of them, a stocky guy with a goatee and a flannel shirt, leaned back in his chair, his eyes landing on Walter. "Hey, old-timer," he called, his tone half joking, half mocking. "That scar on your face. Get that from falling off a bar stool or what?" His buddies chuckled, the sound grating like gravel underfoot. Walter's hand paused on his mug. The scar, a jagged line running from his left temple to his jaw, tightened slightly as his expression stayed neutral. He didn't turn, didn't answer. Just took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam curling around his weathered face. The men laughed again, louder this time, as if his silence was an invitation to keep going. "Bet he's got some stories," another said, smirking. "Probably tripped over his own ego back in the day." The words hung in the air, heavy as the grease sizzling on the grill. Millie, wiping down the counter, shot the men a look, her lips pursed, but she said nothing. She'd seen Walter take worse over the years. Stray comments, dismissive glances, the way people sometimes looked through him like he was part of the furniture. He never reacted, never raised his voice. Just sat there, steady as the flagpole outside. His dignity, a quiet thing that didn't need defending. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the men's laughter lingered, or the way the morning light caught the glint of a pin on Walter's jacket, a small, tarnished bronze star he'd worn every day for decades. Or maybe it was the man who walked through the door just then, his boots clicking against the linoleum with a purpose that made the room pause. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a ramrod-straight posture and a face carved from years of command. His dress blues were immaculate, the silver stars on his shoulders gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. General Thomas Hargrove wasn't a regular at Millie's, but everyone in Willow Creek knew him, or knew of him. A retired Marine Corps officer, he'd grown up here before the world called him away to wars and bases far from home. Now, he was back, a living legend who kept to himself, save for the occasional speech at the VFW Hall or Memorial Day Parade. The general's eyes swept the room, sharp and assessing before landing on Walter. For a moment, their gazes locked, and something passed between them, something unspoken, heavy with history. The men at the corner table fell silent, their bravado fizzling like a spent firecracker. Hargrove's presence demanded attention, not because he sought it, but because it was impossible to ignore. He crossed the diner in 3 strides, his boots steady, and stopped beside Walter's stool. The room held its breath. Millie froze mid-wipe, her rag dangling over the counter. The general extended a hand, not for a shake, but in a slow, deliberate salute. His fingers snapped to his brow, crisp and unwavering, the kind of salute that carried the weight of 1,000 battlefields. "Gunnery Sergeant Grayson," Hargrove said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the diner's hum. "It's an honor, sir." Walter blinked, his coffee forgotten. For a moment he looked almost startled, like a man waking from a long dream. Then, slowly, he straightened, his shoulders squaring as if muscle memory had taken over. He returned the salute, his hand steady, despite the tremor that usually plagued it. The diner was silent now, the only sound, the faint creak of the flag outside and the hiss of bacon on the grill. The men in the corner shifted uncomfortably, their earlier laughter replaced by a tense stillness. They didn't know what was happening, but they felt it. The shift in the air, the sudden weight of something bigger than their small-town bravado. Hargrove lowered his hand, his eyes never leaving Walter's. "I was at Quezon," the general said, his voice softer now, meant for Walter alone, but carrying to every corner of the room. "2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. I was just a lieutenant then, green as hell. But I remember you. You held the line at Hill 881. Saved a lot of good men that day." Walter's jaw tightened, his scar pulling taut. He didn't speak, but his eyes flickered with something raw, something that had been buried for decades. The general reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of handling. He set it on the counter, gently, like it was something sacred. The photo showed a group of Marines, young and grim-faced, standing in the mud of a jungle firebase. Their gear was caked with dirt, their eyes hollow but defiant. In the center, a younger Walter Grayson, his face unscarred but unmistakable, held a rifle with the ease of a man who'd seen too much. The general tapped the photo, his finger resting on Walter's image. "This was taken the day after," Hargrove said. "You carried 3 wounded men off that hill under fire. Never said a word about it. Never asked for anything." The diner was a cathedral now, every ear straining to hear. Millie's eyes glistened, her rag forgotten. The men in the corner stared at their plates, their faces flushed with something that looked like shame. Walter's hand hovered over the photograph, his fingers brushing the edge as if afraid to touch it. His voice when it came was rough but steady. "That was a long time ago, sir," he said. "Just did what needed doing." Hargrove shook his head, a faint smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "No, Gunny, you did what most couldn't. And you've been doing it ever since, haven't you? Coming here, day after day, carrying that weight so the rest of us don't have to." Walter looked down at his coffee, his expression unreadable. The scar on his face seemed less stark now, less a mark of age and more a badge of something enduring. The general straightened, his voice rising just enough to address the room. "This man," he said, gesturing to Walter, "is why we stand here today. Why this town, this country, still has a flag to fly. He didn't ask for your thanks, but he damn well deserves it." The words landed like a gavel. One by one, the diners stood. Millie first, then the trucker at the end of the counter, then a family in the booth by the window. The men in the corner hesitated, then rose too, their earlier mockery forgotten. They didn't clap or cheer. This wasn't that kind of moment. They stood, heads bowed or hands clasped, offering something rarer than applause: respect. Walter's eyes stayed on the photograph, but his posture shifted, a quiet pride settling into his frame. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The general placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture as intimate as it was formal, and nodded. "I'll see you at the VFW tonight, Gunny," Hargrove said. "We're dedicating a plaque. Your name's on it." Walter nodded, his lips twitching into the faintest of smiles. "I'll be there, sir." The general turned to leave, his boots clicking again as he passed the corner table. He didn't look at the men, didn't need to. His point was made. The door swung shut behind him, the bell above it jingling softly. The diner exhaled, the hum of conversation slowly returning, but it was different now, softer, more thoughtful. Millie slid a fresh slice of pie in front of Walter, her eyes warm. "On the house, Walt?" she said, her voice catching. He nodded, his fingers brushing the photograph one last time, before slipping it into his pocket. The men in the corner didn't speak for the rest of their meal. One of them, the stocky one with the goatee, approached Walter as they left. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "Sorry about earlier, man," he said, his eyes on the floor. "Didn't know." Walter looked at him, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Not many do," he said simply. The man nodded, lingering for a moment before following his friends out. As the morning wore on, the diner settled back into its rhythm. But something had shifted. People glanced at Walter now, not with pity or curiosity, but with a quiet curiosity, as if seeing him for the first time. He sipped his coffee, his hands steady now, the bronze star pin catching the light. Outside, the flag snapped in the breeze, its colors brighter against the gray sky. The town of Willow Creek went about its day. But the story of Walter Grayson was no longer just his to carry. It belonged to them now, too. Flashback, Khe-san, 1968. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of cordite. Rain pounded the earth, turning the fire base into a sea of mud. Walter, 22 and wiry, crouched behind a sandbag wall, his M16 slick with rain. The screams of the wounded cut through the roar of artillery, and the hill, 881 South, was a chaos of fire and shadow. He didn't think about the fear, didn't let it take root. There were men down, and they weren't going to make it unless someone moved. He ran. Bullets kicked up mud around him, close enough to feel their heat. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he reached the first man, a kid, barely 19, his leg torn open. Walter slung him over his shoulder, staggering under the weight, and ran back to the line. Then he went again, and again. 3 times, through hell itself, until the medics took over. When it was over, the hill held. The men he'd carried lived. Walter didn't talk about it, didn't see the point. The scar came later, a shard of shrapnel from a mortar that missed his eye by an inch. He'd laughed it off then, said it made him look tougher. But the weight of that day, and all the days after, settled into his bones, a quiet burden he'd carry for 50 years. Back in the diner by noon, the story had spread. Millie told the cook, who told the delivery guy, who told the clerk at the gas station. By evening, the VFW hall was packed, more than it had been in years. Walter sat near the front, his old dress blues a little tight but still fitting, the bronze star pinned to his chest. The plaque was simple, brass with his name, etched beside others from Willow Creek who'd served. But it wasn't the plaque that mattered. It was the hands that shook his, the voices that said, "Thank you," the eyes that saw him. The general spoke briefly, his words sharp and clear, about duty and sacrifice, and the men who carried both without complaint. When he finished, the room stood again, this time with a slow, deliberate applause that felt like a promise. Walter didn't cry. Marines didn't, not in public. But his hand lingered on the photograph in his pocket, the one Hargrove had returned to him. As the crowd thinned, a young girl, maybe 10, approached him. She held a folded flag, one of those small ones they hand out at parades. Her mother stood behind her, nodding encouragingly. "My grandpa was a Marine," the girl said, her voice small but clear. "He'd want you to have this." Walter took the flag, his fingers gentle, and nodded. "Semper Fi, kid," he said, his voice thick. She smiled, and for a moment, the weight he'd carried felt lighter. The VFW hall in Willow Creek smelled of polished wood and old memories, the kind that clung to the walls alongside faded photographs and framed medals. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a warm glow over the crowd that lingered after the plaque dedication. Walter Grayson sat near the front, his dress blues stiff but familiar, the bronze star pin glinting faintly on his chest. The room was fuller than it had been in years, packed with faces both familiar and new. Townsfolk who'd heard the story of the morning at Millie's diner and come to see the man they'd overlooked for so long. Outside, the autumn air grew colder, the flag in the square snapping sharply against the evening sky, its rhythm a steady heartbeat for the town. Walter's hands rested on his knees, the folded flag from the young girl tucked carefully into his pocket beside the photograph General Hargrove had given him. He hadn't expected this. The crowd, the applause, the weight of eyes that now saw him. For decades, he'd moved through Willow Creek like a shadow, his past a private thing he carried in silence. The scar on his face, the tattoo on his arm, the pin he never removed. They were markers of a life he didn't talk about, not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't think anyone cared. Tonight, though, something had shifted. The town was listening. General Hargrove stood at the podium, his dress blues as crisp as they'd been that morning, his silver stars catching the light. He'd finished his speech, but he lingered, his eyes scanning the room, before settling on Walter again. The general's presence was a quiet command, the kind that didn't need words to hold a room. He stepped down from the podium and approached Walter, extending a hand. Not for a salute this time, but for a firm, deliberate shake. "Gunny," Hargrove said, his voice low, but carrying the same weight it had in the diner. "You've done this town proud. Always have." Walter met his gaze, his own eyes steady, despite the emotion tugging at their edges. "Just did my job, sir," he said, his voice rough but even. It was the same answer he'd given for 50 years, but tonight it felt different, like a truth that had finally found its place. The general smiled, a rare crack in his stern demeanor. "Your job changed lives, Walt. Don't forget that." He paused, then added, "You've got a place here always. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The words landed softly, but they carried a weight that settled into Walter's chest. He nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line, and the general stepped back, giving him space to absorb the moment. The crowd began to disperse, some heading for the refreshment table, others lingering to talk in hushed tones. A few approached Walter, old-timers from the VFW, a couple of kids with questions about the Marines, a woman who said her father had served in Vietnam and never talked about it either. Each conversation was brief, respectful, but they added up, like stones building a wall against the loneliness that had crept into Walter's days. Millie was there too, her apron swapped for a simple dress, her eyes still bright from the morning's events. She handed Walter a cup of coffee, black, the way he liked it, and sat beside him. "You know, Walt," she said, her voice soft, "I've been pouring your coffee for 20 years, and I never knew. Should have asked." Walter took a sip, the warmth grounding him. "Didn't need to, Millie. You've always been kind." It was true. Millie's diner had been his refuge, a place where he could sit quietly and feel part of something, even if no one knew his story. Her small acts, refilling his cup without asking, saving him the last slice of pie, had been a kind of recognition, even if she hadn't known it. The evening wore on, and the hall began to empty. Walter stayed, reluctant to leave the warmth of the moment. He wasn't one for crowds, but tonight felt different, like a chapter closing and another beginning. As he sat, his fingers brushed the photograph in his pocket, and his mind drifted back, not to Quezon this time, but to the years after, the quiet ones that had shaped him just as much. Flashback, Willow Creek, 1975. Walter had come home to Willow Creek after his discharge, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his scar still fresh and angry. The town hadn't changed much. Same diner, same flagpole, same faces in the pews on Sunday. But it felt different, smaller somehow, like it couldn't hold the weight of what he'd seen. People clapped him on the back, called him a hero, but their eyes slid away when he tried to talk about the war. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know how to listen to stories that didn't have clean endings. He'd taken a job at the lumberyard, hauling timber until his back ached, saving enough to buy a small house on the edge of town. He didn't talk about the Marines, didn't wear his uniform. The Bronze Star stayed in a drawer, tucked beneath a stack of letters he'd never sent to his mother during the war. He'd wanted to spare her the worry, but now she was gone, and the letters were all he had left of her. The years blurred together, work, church, the diner. He'd never married, never felt the need to explain why. There'd been a girl once, before Vietnam, but she'd moved on while he was overseas, and he didn't blame her. Life moved on, and Walter let it. He volunteered at the VFW, helped with the Memorial Day flags, mowed the lawn at the cemetery. Small things, quiet things, the kind that didn't ask for thanks. But there were moments, late at night when the house was too quiet, that the weight came back. The screams from Hill 881, the faces of the men he couldn't save. He'd sit on his porch, a cigarette burning down to his fingers, and wonder if he'd done enough. The scar on his face, the one that drew stares or stupid comments, was a reminder of the cost. Not just of the war, but of coming home to a world that didn't quite know what to do with him. Back in the VFW hall. The hall was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers folding chairs and sweeping the floor. Walter stood to leave, his joints protesting as he adjusted his cap. The young girl who'd given him the flag was still there, sitting with her mother near the door. She waved shyly, and Walter tipped his cap, a small gesture that made her smile. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him, sharp and clean. The flag in the square was still, the wind having died down, but its silhouette stood proud against the starry sky. Walter paused, his breath visible in the chill, and felt the photograph in his pocket again. He pulled it out, studying the faces of the men he'd served with. Most were gone now, some to the war, others to time. But they were with him tonight, their memory carried in the weight of the general's salute, the girl's flag, the town's quiet acknowledgement. The next morning, Willow Creek woke to a changed rhythm. The story of Walter Grayson spread beyond the diner and the VFW hall, carried by whispers and phone calls, by posts on the town's small X page. People stopped by Millie's to see him, some bringing small tokens, a handshake, a thank you, a story of their own. The men from the corner table didn't show up again, but the stocky one with the goatee sent a note through Millie, apologizing again and asking if he could buy Walter a coffee sometime. Walter didn't hold a grudge. He'd seen worse than their ignorance in his time. By week's end, the town council met to discuss a new project, a small memorial in the square. Nothing grand, just a bench with a plaque for Willow Creek's veterans, Walter's name among them. It wasn't his idea, but he didn't fight it. When they asked him to speak at the groundbreaking, he agreed, though he kept his remarks short. "I'm no hero," he said that day, standing by the flagpole, his voice steady despite the crowd. "Just a man who did his job. But if this bench helps you remember the ones who didn't come home, or the ones still carrying the war, that's enough for me." The crowd clapped, not loudly, but with a sincerity that warmed the autumn air. The bench was simple, its plaque etched with names that spanned wars and decades. Walter sat on it after the ceremony, his hands resting on the cool metal, and watched the town move around him. Kids played in the square, their laughter sharp and bright. An old man tipped his hat as he passed. Millie brought him a coffee, even though they were nowhere near the diner. "You're going to have to start charging me for these," Walter said, a rare grin tugging at his lips. Millie laughed. "Not a chance, Walt. You've earned every cup." The bench became a fixture, a place where people stopped to talk, to reflect, to remember. Veterans from other wars started showing up, sharing stories they'd kept quiet for years. The town listened, and Willow Creek began to feel like a place where the past wasn't just a shadow, but a foundation. Walter didn't change much. He still came to Millie's every morning, still wore his cap and his pin, still carried the photograph and the flag. But his shoulders were a little straighter, his eyes a little brighter. The scar on his face, once a mark of dismissal, became a badge of quiet pride. He'd never sought recognition, but now that it had come, he carried it with the same dignity he'd carried everything else. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the square gold, the young girl from the VFW hall ran up to him, her mother trailing behind. She held out a drawing, a crayon sketch of a Marine in dress blues, a flag in the background. "It's you," she said, beaming. Walter took the drawing, his fingers careful not to smudge it. "Looks better than me," he said, his voice soft. The girl giggled, and her mother smiled, her eyes saying what words didn't need to. As they walked away, Walter sat on the bench, the drawing in one hand, the photograph in the other. The flag above him snapped once in a sudden breeze, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. Not because the war was gone, it never would be, but because he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. This is the conclusion of Walter Grayson's story, a testament to the power of small acts of compassion and the enduring strength of those who serve quietly. In Willow Creek, a town like so many others, one man's past became a bridge to a better future, reminding us all to look closer, to listen harder, to honor the unseen. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories for more tales of quiet heroism. And take a moment today to notice the Walter Graysons in your own community. Who knows what stories they carry, waiting for someone to see? 30 years ago, his name had been inked in bold across the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette. "Local hero saves two under fire." The photograph showed a younger Walter, square-jawed and steely-eyed, his dress blues crisp as he stood on a makeshift stage at the town's Memorial Day parade. He'd been 23, barely back from Vietnam, his chest heavy with a bronze star for dragging two wounded Marines to safety under a hail of mortar fire. The town had cheered. Children tugged at his sleeves for pictures. The mayor, sweat beading on his brow, had handed Walter the key to a small apartment on Maple Street, a gesture of gratitude that felt like a promise. "You're one of us," it said. "We'll never forget." But promises fade faster than newsprint. The apartment was long gone, lost to a bad loan when medical bills piled up after surgery in '98. The parade photos were stuffed in a box somewhere, or maybe burned. Walter couldn't remember. His buddies from the war were either dead or scattered, their letters unanswered, their voices reduced to echoes in his dreams. The world had moved on, and Walter's name, once a beacon, had become inconvenient. In the 90s, the town's new leadership didn't want reminders of a war they'd rather forget. The Gazette archives were misplaced during a library renovation. The honor board in the town square, where Walter's name had once gleamed, was replaced with a digital billboard advertising car insurance. Now, at 75, Walter lived in a single room at the Willow Creek Home for Veterans, a squat brick building that smelled of bleach and regret. His dress blues hung in a closet, untouched, the gold buttons dull with dust. The only thing he carried from those days was the photograph, a grainy black and white of him and his squad, grinning in the jungle, their faces young and unscarred, and the bronze star, which he kept pinned to the wall above his bed. It was his anchor, proof that he'd once been more than a shadow on a bench. Every morning, Walter walked the half-mile to the park, his steps slow but deliberate, his cane tapping the pavement like a metronome. He'd sit, sip his tea, and watch the world unfold. Joggers in bright spandex, mothers pushing strollers, kids chasing soccer balls. He didn't expect anyone to notice him. He didn't want their pity. But sometimes, when the wind carried the faint notes of the national anthem from a nearby school, his shoulders would straighten and his fingers would trace the edges of the photograph, as if he could step back into that moment when he was whole. It was a Tuesday when the boy appeared. The park was quieter than usual, the morning air sharp with the promise of frost. Walter was halfway through his thermos, the tea gone cold, when he heard the crunch of gravel. A kid, no older than 8, stood a few feet away, his sneakers scuffed and his hoodie too big for his skinny frame. His dark eyes were wide, curious, fixed on Walter like he was a puzzle to solve. "You a soldier?" the boy asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Walter blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't been asked that in years. His first instinct was to wave the kid off, to sink back into his solitude. But something in the boy's gaze, earnest, unguarded, held him. Walter's eyes flicked to the tattoo peeking from his collar, then back to the kid. "Was," he said finally, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. "A long time ago." The boy stepped closer, undeterred. "My grandpa says soldiers have medals. You got any?" Walter's hand tightened around the thermos. He could have lied, could have said no, and sent the kid running. But the boy's question wasn't just curiosity. It was a spark, a tiny flare in the fog of Walter's days. He reached into his pocket, where he sometimes carried the bronze star, not to show it off, but to feel its weight, a reminder that he'd done something worth remembering. He pulled it out, the ribbon faded, but the star still gleaming faintly in the morning light. The boy's eyes widened, his mouth forming a small O. "Is that real?" Walter nodded, his throat tight. "Real as it gets." The boy reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering. "Can I?" Walter hesitated. The metal was more than metal. It was the screams of that night in '69, the weight of his buddy's blood on his hands, the endless march through the mud to safety. But the boy's face, so open and unguarded, reminded him of the kids at the parade all those years ago. He pressed the metal into the boy's palm. "Barry," he said, his voice softer now. "Take it. But remember, it weighs more than it seems." The boy's fingers closed around the metal, his grin bright as the sun breaking through clouds. "Thanks, mister," he called, already sprinting back to a woman waiting near the gazebo, her arms crossed against the chill. Walter watched them go, the boy waving the medal like a trophy, the mother glancing back with a puzzled frown. He waited for the usual pang of regret, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet warmth, like the first sip of tea on a cold morning. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't need to. For the first time in years, someone had seen him. Not the old man on the bench, but Walter Ellis, the Marine who'd carried his brothers to safety. The next morning, Walter didn't go to the park. He woke with a heaviness in his chest, not from illness, but from a sense that something had shifted. The medal was gone, given away on a whim, and with it, a piece of his armor. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty spot on the wall where the bronze star had hung. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with the ghosts of his past. He thought of the boy's grin, the way it had lit up the park, and wondered if he'd done something foolish or something right. Instead of his usual walk, Walter stayed in, sorting through the box under his bed. It was a battered thing, held together with duct tape, filled with relics he rarely touched. Letters from his squad, a faded American flag, a newspaper clipping from the Gazette with the headline, "Our Hero." The photograph was there too, the one he carried to the park, but seeing it now in the dim light of his room felt different. The young men in the picture were strangers, their smiles frozen in a moment that no longer existed. He traced their faces, lingering on the two he'd saved, Bobby and Ray, their names as sharp in his mind as the day he'd lost them to time. The day passed in a blur of routine. A lukewarm breakfast in the home's dining hall, the drone of a TV nobody watched, the shuffle of other residents moving through their own quiet lives. Walter kept to himself, as always, but his thoughts kept drifting to the park, to the boy, to the medal now in a child's hands. He wondered if the kid would lose it, or if he'd keep it safe, maybe show it off to his friends. The thought made Walter smile, a rare thing that felt foreign on his face. By evening, he'd made up his mind. He'd go back to the park tomorrow, not for the boy, not for the medal, but because it was his place, his ritual. He needed it as much as the park needed its flag or its pond. He fell asleep with the photograph on his nightstand, the clipping tucked beside it, the words, "Our Hero," barely legible in the fading ink. When Walter arrived at the park the next morning, the bench was different. A single red carnation lay across it, its petals vibrant against the weathered wood. Beside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, but unmistakable. It was the Gazette clipping, the one he'd kept in his box, though he hadn't brought it to the park in years. He picked it up, his hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of memory. The headline stared back at him, "Our Hero." He looked around, half expecting to see the boy or his mother, but the park was empty, the flagpole casting a long shadow in the dawn light. The carnation smelled faintly sweet, like the flowers at the Memorial Day parade all those years ago. Walter sat, the clipping in one hand, the flower in the other, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride or vindication, but something quieter, deeper, a sense that he wasn't as forgotten as he'd thought. He didn't know who'd left the carnation or how they'd found the clipping. Maybe the boy's mother had dug through old records, or maybe someone else in Willow Creek had remembered. It didn't matter. For the first time in decades, Walter felt seen. This is just the beginning of Walter's story, a tale of quiet heroism and the power of small acts to restore dignity. In the next part, we'll uncover who left the carnation, how Walter's past comes to light, and the ripple effect his moment of recognition has on Willow Creek. For more stories of gratitude and grace, subscribe to Hoffman's Stories and join us in honoring the unsung heroes in our communities. The red carnation lay on Walter Ellis's nightstand now, its petals curling slightly at the edges, but still vivid against the gray of his room at the Willow Creek Home for Veterans. Beside it was the Gazette clipping, the headline, "Our Hero," staring up at him like a ghost from 1969. Walter hadn't returned to the park since finding them on his bench 2 days ago. The weight of that moment, someone, somewhere, remembering him, kept him tethered to his room, sorting through memories he'd long buried. The photograph of his squad, the one he'd carried to the park for years, sat propped against the wall, its faces clearer in his mind than ever. Bobby's crooked grin, Ray's quiet eyes, the jungle heat, the mortar blasts, the endless march to safety. It was all there, sharp as a blade. Outside, Willow Creek hummed with its usual rhythm, the clatter of dishes at the diner, the drone of traffic on Main Street, the laughter of kids spilling out of the school. But inside Walter's room, time felt suspended, as if the carnation and the clipping had cracked open a door to the past. He didn't know who'd left them, but the gesture gnawed at him, not with suspicion, but with a quiet ache. For 30 years, he'd been invisible, a shadow on a bench. Now, someone had seen him. The question was why? The answer came on a chilly Thursday morning, when a knock rattled the door of Walter's room. He opened it to find Mrs. Hargrove, the home's director, her glasses perched low on her nose. She held an envelope, its edges crisp and official-looking, with Willow Creek Veterans Association stamped in the corner. "Walter," she said, her voice softer than her usual brisk tone, "this came for you. They're asking you to come to the community center tomorrow. Some kind of event." Walter took the envelope, his fingers brushing the embossed seal. "What kind of event?" Mrs. Hargrove shrugged, but her eyes lingered on him, curious. "Didn't say much. Just that it's important and they want you there. Dress nice if you can." He nodded, closing the door as she shuffled off. The envelope felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than paper. He slid it open with a pocket knife, pulling out a single sheet. The letter was brief, typed in formal font, inviting him to a special recognition ceremony at the community center. No details, no explanation, just a time, 10 a.m., and a request to bring any personal artifacts of service. At the bottom, a handwritten note in blue ink. "We haven't forgotten." Walter's chest tightened. He sat on the edge of his bed, the letter trembling in his hands. Recognition? After all these years? It felt like a trick or maybe a mistake. He hadn't been to a veterans event in decades, not since the town stopped inviting him to parades. His name wasn't on any lists anymore. Yet here was this letter, pulling him back into a world he'd thought had closed its doors. He glanced at the closet where his dress blues hung, untouched since the 80s. The thought of wearing them again made his stomach churn. They wouldn't fit, not with the years and the scars and the weight of time. But the letter's words, "we haven't forgotten," stuck with him, like the boy's question in the park. You, a soldier? He thought of the carnation, the clipping, the metal now in a child's hands. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a chance. The Willow Creek Community Center was a low, brick building with a sagging roof and a parking lot cracked by weeds. On Friday morning, it buzzed with more life than Walter had seen in years. Cars lined the street, American flags fluttered from lampposts, and a small crowd milled outside, their voices carrying on the crisp air. The scent of coffee and fresh-baked donuts wafted from a table near the entrance, where volunteers in red vests handed out cups. A banner stretched above the door, honoring our veterans. Walter paused at the edge of the lot, his cane planted firmly, his breath fogging in the cold. He wore a clean flannel shirt and his old army jacket, the best he could manage. In his pocket was the photograph, and under his arm, a small box with the Gazette clipping and a folded letter from Bobby, written days before he died in 71. Inside, the center was warm and noisy, the gym transformed with rows of folding chairs and a makeshift stage. A projector screen displayed a slideshow of old photos. Soldiers in Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Walter scanned the crowd. Gray-haired men in VFW caps, younger veterans in camouflage jackets, families with kids clutching tiny flags. He felt out of place, like a ghost wandering into someone else's story. He found a seat in the back, hoping to slip through unnoticed. The ceremony began with a color guard, high school cadets marching in with flags. The crowd stood for the Pledge of Allegiance, hands over hearts, and Walter's voice joined theirs, low but steady. A local pastor offered a prayer, followed by the mayor, new since Walter's time, giving a speech about sacrifice and service. Walter's eyes drifted to the slideshow, catching a grainy image of a Marine in dress blues. His breath caught. It was him. From the 1969 parade, the Gazette photo he'd thought was lost forever. Before he could process it, a voice cut through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," said a man at the podium, tall and silver-haired, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a military officer. "I'm Colonel James Tanner, retired, and today we're here to right a wrong." The room quieted, heads turning. Walter's hands tightened on his cane. 30 years ago, Tanner continued, this town honored a Marine who risked everything to save his brothers. His name was Walter Ellis. He was our hero. But time has a way of dimming memories, and we let his story fade. Today, we're bringing it back. Walter froze, his pulse hammering. Heads turned, searching the room, but he shrank into his seat, his face burning. How did they know? Who had done this? The colonel's eyes found him, sharp and unwavering, and he gestured toward the stage. Mr. Ellis, would you join us, please? The crowd murmured, then began to clap, the sound swelling like a wave. Walter's legs felt leaden, but he stood, his cane tapping as he made his way forward. The applause grew, and he felt every eye on him, not with pity, but with something he hadn't felt in decades: respect. He climbed the stage, his back straight despite the ache in his knees, and faced the crowd. Colonel Tanner saluted him, crisp and deliberate, and Walter returned it, his hand trembling but sure. The colonel turned to the audience. In 1969, Corporal Walter Ellis, under heavy mortar fire in Vietnam, carried 2 wounded Marines to safety. He was the only one of his squad to survive that night. For his actions, he received the Bronze Star. But his sacrifice didn't end there. He came home to a town that promised to remember, then let him slip away. We're here to say, we see you, Walter. We remember. The crowd stood, their applause thundering. Walter's throat burned, his eyes stinging. He scanned the faces, searching for something: anger, indifference, anything to anchor him. Instead, he saw pride, tears, hands raised in salute. At the edge of the stage, he noticed a boy in a too-big hoodie, clutching a familiar medal. It was the kid from the park, standing with a woman who must have been his mother, her eyes wet but smiling. Beside them was an older man in a VFW cap, his face weathered but kind. Walter didn't know him, but the man nodded, as if sharing a secret. Colonel Tanner handed Walter a plaque, engraved with his name and the words, "Hero of Willow Creek." "This is long overdue," he said, his voice low enough for only Walter to hear. "And it's not all." The slideshow shifted, and a new image appeared. The Gazette clipping, blown up large, the headline bold. Below it, a photograph Walter hadn't seen in years. A candid shot of him and Bobby, laughing in the jungle, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The crowd gasped softly, and Walter's hand went to his pocket, where the same photo rested. How had they found it? The colonel leaned in. "A young man brought this to us. Said he found it with a medal you gave him. His mother tracked down the rest." Walter's eyes flicked to the boy, who grinned, waving the Bronze Star like a flag. The mother mouthed, "Thank you," and the older man, maybe her father, maybe a veteran himself, saluted. Walter nodded back, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. The ceremony ended with a reception, coffee and donuts, replaced by sandwiches and lemonade. People approached Walter, shaking his hand, sharing stories of their own service or their father's wars. He listened, his voice quiet but steady, the plaque heavy in his hands. The boy, whose name was Ethan, he learned, tugged at his sleeve. "I kept your medal safe," Ethan said, holding it out, "but Mom says it's yours." Walter knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees. "You hold on to it a bit longer, son. Just keep it safe." Ethan's grin returned, and he saluted, sloppy but sincere. Walter chuckled, the sound rusty but real. Later, Colonel Tanner pulled him aside. "We're starting a permanent exhibit at the library," he said. "Your story, others like it. We want your photo, your clippings, anything you're willing to share. This town won't forget again." Walter nodded, his gaze drifting to the crowd. He saw Mrs. Hargrove chatting with the mayor, Ethan's mother showing the old veteran a scrapbook, kids running with flags. The community center felt less like a building and more like a hearth, warm with shared purpose. He thought of the carnation, the clipping, the bench in the park. He didn't know who had left them. Maybe Ethan's mother, maybe the old veteran who'd saluted. But he knew what they meant. A spark. A reminder that even shadows can be seen. "I'll bring some things," Walter said finally, his voice steady, "for the exhibit." Tanner clapped his shoulder. "Good man." That night, Walter returned to his room, the plaque on his nightstand beside the carnation, which was now fully wilted but still bright. He opened his box, pulling out the letter from Bobby, the flag, the clippings. He'd share them not for the glory, but to keep his squad's memory alive. He thought of Ethan, the boy with his medal, and the colonel's words, "We see you." For the first time in decades, Walter felt the weight of his past lighten, not gone, but shared. The next morning, he walked to the park, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. He sat on his bench, the air cool and the flagpole snapping in the breeze. He didn't bring the thermos, didn't need it. Instead, he brought the plaque, its simple words, "Hero." A jogger passed, nodded, and Walter nodded back. A mother with a stroller smiled, and he tipped his chin. They were small acts, but they carried weight, like a medal, like a memory, like a carnation left on a bench. Willow Creek changed after that day. The library exhibit opened a month later, Walter's story at its center, alongside photos and letters from other veterans. Ethan visited often, the Bronze Star pinned to his backpack, his questions endless but welcome. The community center started a monthly veterans breakfast, and the mayor promised a new bench in the park, engraved with Walter's name. Small acts, a nod, a salute, a story shared, rippled outward, reminding the town to see its own. Walter's story is a call to notice the quiet heroes among us, the ones who carry their sacrifices silently. Who are they in your community? A veteran, a faded tattoo, barely visible? A neighbor with a story untold? Take a moment to ask, to listen, to honor. For more tales of gratitude and grace, subscribe to Hoffman's Stories and join us in celebrating the unsung. Frank Merrill sat on a folding chair at the edge of the sidewalk, his old Marine Corps dress blues hanging loosely on his frame. At 84, his shoulders still held a faint echo of the squared posture he'd learned in boot camp. But time had softened the edges. His hands, folded in his lap, bore the faint tremble of age, and a faded anchor tattoo peeked from beneath his cuff, the ink blurred like a memory half forgotten. The uniform was a relic, pulled from a cedar chest he hadn't opened in years. A volunteer had helped him into it that morning, her hands gentle but hurried, as she pinned a small veteran's badge to his chest. "You look sharp, Mr. Merrill," she'd said, and Frank had nodded, his lips twitching into a polite smile. He didn't tell her the jacket smelled of mothballs, or that the weight of it felt heavier than he remembered. The parade was a blur of motion and sound. A high school marching band blared "Sweet Caroline," the tuba slightly off-key. Fire trucks rolled by, sirens silent, but lights flashing. A group of Boy Scouts carried a banner that read, "Honor our heroes." Frank watched it all, his eyes distant, as if he were looking through the scene rather than at it. Every so often, someone would approach. A young mother with a toddler on her hip, a man in a VFW cap, a teenager snapping a selfie. "Thank you for your service," they'd say, the words quick and practiced, like a reflex. Frank would nod again, his smile steady, but never quite reaching his eyes. The teenager, a lanky kid with a phone and a backward baseball cap, grinned as he took the photo. "You're a legend, man," he said before disappearing into the crowd. The parade ended with a bugler playing taps, the notes hanging in the air like a held breath. The crowd stood still, hands over hearts, as the flag on the courthouse lawn snapped sharply in the wind. Frank's fingers tightened around the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening. He didn't stand, not because he didn't want to, but because his knees wouldn't let him. No one noticed. The moment passed, and the crowd dispersed, leaving behind crumpled paper cups and the faint echo of applause. Frank returned to his trailer on the edge of town, a rusted single-wide perched on a plot of weedy grass. The volunteers had offered to drive him, but he'd waved them off, insisting on the walk. It was only a mile, and the exercise kept the stiffness at bay. Inside, the trailer was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into the bones. The air smelled of old wood and liniment. A single photograph hung on the wall, Frank and his wife, Ellen, on their wedding day in 1966, her smile bright against the sepia fade of time. She'd been gone 5 years now, and the silence she'd left behind was louder than any parade. He hung the uniform back in the cedar chest, smoothing the fabric with care. The badge, a cheap thing with a plastic pin, sat on the kitchen counter. He stared at it for a moment before tucking it into a drawer. The television flickered on, tuned to a cable news channel droning about inflation and AI breakthroughs. Frank sank into his recliner, the springs creaking under his weight. The day's noise faded, and the world outside his window moved on. 7 days later, the trailer was still. The television played on low, a documentary about Vietnam flickering across the screen, grainy footage of helicopters and jungles, a narrator's voice recounting battles Frank had lived through. On his lap lay a yellowed citation, the paper brittle at the edges. It was a Navy Cross, awarded in 1969 for extraordinary heroism in a village near Da Nang. The words were formal, almost cold, but they carried the weight of a night he'd never spoken of. Not to Ellen, not to his kids, not to the neighbors who occasionally dropped off casseroles. He'd pulled it from the chest that morning, though he couldn't say why. Maybe it was the parade. The way the crowd's cheers had felt like an echo of something he couldn't quite grasp. The air in the trailer had grown heavy, stale with the scent of unwashed dishes, and something sharper, something wrong. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, paused on her evening walk, her nose wrinkling at a faint odor carried on the breeze. She knocked on Frank's door softly at first, then harder. No answer. Her hand hesitated over her phone before she dialed the sheriff's office. The deputy who arrived was young, barely 30, with a clean-shaven face and a name tag that read J. Carter. He knocked again, called out, "Mr. Merrill?" The silence pressed back. Carter glanced at Mrs. Callahan, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes wide with worry. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, they found Frank in his recliner, his head tilted back, eyes closed, as if he were only sleeping. The television still murmured, the documentary looping to a segment about Kaisan. The citation lay across his lap, its edges curling inward. Carter's breath caught, not from the smell, but from the sight of the paper. The words Navy Cross, bold against the faded ink. He didn't touch it. He radioed for the coroner, his voice low, respectful. Mrs. Callahan stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. "He was at the parade," she whispered. Everyone was clapping for him. The story broke the next morning in the Millersburg Gazette, a small headline tucked below the fold. Local veteran found dead, days after Memorial Day honor. The reporter, a young woman fresh out of journalism school, had dug just deep enough to find the citation in the county records. Her article was short but sharp, detailing Frank's service in Vietnam, the Navy Cross, and the quiet life he'd led since. She quoted Mrs. Callahan, "He never talked about it, but you could see it in his eyes. He carried something heavy." By noon, the story had been picked up by a Cleveland news outlet, then shared across social media. The headline morphed as it spread, "Veteran dies alone after town's applause fades." On X, the posts multiplied, each one a spark in a growing fire. "This is America in 2025, one user wrote. "We clap for veterans on Memorial Day, then forget them by Tuesday." Another posted, "I'm calling my grandpa tonight. He's a vet, and I don't want him to feel like this." A third, simpler, rawer, "Sorry, Frank. We didn't deserve you." The teenager from the parade, Ethan, saw the article on his phone while scrolling during lunch. His thumb froze over the screen, the selfie with Frank staring back at him. In the photo, Frank's smile was tight, his eyes looking somewhere beyond the camera. Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't known Frank's name until now. He opened TikTok, his fingers moving before his brain caught up. He filmed himself in his bedroom, the parade selfie on his phone screen as he spoke. "I took this picture with Frank Merrill last week," he said, his voice cracking. "He was a hero, like a real one. Navy Cross, Vietnam, all that. And we just let him sit there alone after. I didn't even ask his name." He paused, swallowing hard. "We can't keep doing this. If you know a veteran, go talk to them. Like, really talk. Don't wait for a parade." He posted the video at 3:17 p.m. By midnight, it had 1 million views. 40 years earlier, in the summer of 1969, Frank had crouched in the mud outside a village near Da Nang, his M16 heavy in his hands. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and cordite. His squad was pinned down, a machine gun nest spitting rounds from a hillside. The radio was dead and the screams of a wounded corporal cut through the night. Frank hadn't thought about medals or glory. He'd thought about the kid from Ohio next to him, barely 19, bleeding out in the dark. He'd moved before he could second guess himself, crawling through the mud, dragging the kid to cover, then charging the nest alone. 3 grenades and a magazine later, the gun was silent. The kid lived. Frank never spoke of it. The citation came months later, handed to him in a brief ceremony he barely remembered. He'd tucked it into a drawer when he got home, next to Ellen's letters. She'd asked about it once, her fingers tracing the paper, but he'd shaken his head. "It's just a thing," he'd said. She never asked again. His kids, grown now and scattered across cities he'd never visited, knew their dad had been a Marine, but the details were shadows. They called on holidays, sent cards with generic messages. Frank didn't mind. He'd never been one for stories. The trailer, the chest, the citation, they were enough. Or so he'd told himself. The TikTok video kept spreading. By the next morning, it had 5 million views. Comments poured in, thousands of them, from people sharing stories of their own grandparents, uncles, neighbors. A woman in Texas wrote about driving to a VA hospital to read to veterans. A man in Florida started a group to mow lawns for elderly vets. In Millersburg, a local diner put up a sign, "Free coffee for veterans, any day, any time." The owner, a gruff man who'd never served, said it was the least he could do. Ethan, overwhelmed by the response, went back to the trailer. It was empty now, the coroner long gone, but he stood in the gravel drive staring at the faded curtains in the window. He didn't know what he was looking for. Forgiveness, maybe, or a way to make it right. He posted another video that night, this time from the trailer's steps. "This is where Frank lived," he said, his voice steadier now. "He wasn't just a veteran. He was a person. And we're going to make sure nobody forgets that." The town council met that week, spurred by the article and the videos. They voted to rename a small park on the edge of town Merrill Memorial Park. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass with a swing set and a bench. But they planned to add a plaque with Frank's name and the words from his citation. The teenager, Ethan, was invited to the unveiling. He didn't speak, but he stood there, his phone in his pocket, his eyes on the ground. Mrs. Callahan planted a rose bush outside Frank's trailer, the red blooms stark against the faded siding. She didn't say much, just watered it every morning, her way of keeping him close. Subscribe to Hoffman's stories for the continuation, and take a moment today to notice the quiet heroes in your own town. A nod, a conversation, a held door. They matter more than you know. The rosebush outside Frank Merrill's trailer bloomed fiercely in the weeks following his death, its red petals a quiet defiance against the faded gray of the siding. Millersburg, Ohio, was no stranger to loss. Small towns never are. But Frank's passing cut deeper than most. The Gazette article and Ethan's viral TikTok had cracked open something in the community. A mix of guilt and resolve that lingered like the scent of rain on asphalt. The park renaming was a start, but it wasn't enough. Not for Ethan, not for Mrs. Callahan, not for the dozens of strangers who left flowers at the trailer's steps, their notes scrawled with apologies and promises. Ethan, the teenager whose selfie with Frank had sparked the movement, couldn't shake the image of the old man's face. That tight smile, those eyes that seemed to see past the parade, past the flags, past the noise. He'd gone back to the trailer again, this time with permission from the county, which hadn't yet decided what to do with the property. The door creaked as he stepped inside, the air heavy with dust and the faint tang of liniment. The recliner still sat by the window, its cushions worn into the shape of Frank's body. The television was off now, the Navy Cross citation gone, taken by the coroner for safekeeping. Ethan's sneakers scuffed the linoleum as he moved toward the cedar chest in the corner. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, the dress blues were neatly folded, the fabric stiff with age. Beneath them lay a small metal box, no bigger than a cigar tin, its surface scratched and dented. Ethan's fingers hovered over it. He wasn't sure if he had the right to look, but something, maybe the weight of his own guilt, pushed him to open it. Inside was a stack of letters, their envelopes yellowed, tied with a frayed ribbon. A black and white photo slipped out, landing face up on the floor. It showed a young Frank, maybe 20, in jungle fatigues, his arms slung around another Marine. Both were grinning, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, a burning village blurred in the background. On the back, in faded ink, Da Nang, 69. Me and Tommy. We made it. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, the letters in his lap. He read one, then another, his breath catching at the careful handwriting. Ellen's, Frank's wife. Come home safe, Frankie. I'm waiting. The words were simple, but they carried a tenderness that made Ethan's chest ache. Tucked among the letters was a folded piece of paper, different from the rest. It was a letter from a man named Thomas Reed, dated 1970, addressed to Frank at a VA hospital in Cincinnati. You saved my life out there, it read. I owe you everything. Don't you dare forget that. Ethan's eyes stung. He closed the box, slipping the photo into his pocket. He didn't know why, but he needed to keep it close. In 1969, Frank Merrill was 22, a lance corporal with a knack for keeping his squad calm under fire. The night in Da Nang wasn't his first firefight, but it was the one that stayed with him, carved into his memory like initials on a tree. The village was a smear of smoke and screams, the air thick with the stench of burning thatch and blood. Tommy Reed, the kid from Akron who'd joined the Marines to escape a dead-end factory job, was hit in the leg, his screams raw and panicked. The machine gun nest on the hill was relentless, pinning them in a ditch. Frank didn't think about medals or heroism. He thought about Tommy, about the way he'd shared his last cigarette the night before, joking about opening a bar when they got home. Frank moved without a plan, crawling through the mud, his rifle slung across his back. He dragged Tommy to a cluster of rocks, then turned toward the hill. The grenades were heavy in his hands, the pins cold against his fingers. He didn't remember throwing them, only the silence that followed, the sudden absence of gunfire. Tommy lived. 2 others in the squad didn't. Frank carried their names, Jenkins and Alvarez, like stones in his chest for the rest of his life. The Navy Cross came later, a formality he didn't understand. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital, a shrapnel wound in his shoulder leaving a scar he could still trace with his thumb. Ellen's letters arrived every other day, her words a lifeline. When he came home, she was waiting at the bus station, her dress blue as the summer sky. He didn't talk about the war, and she didn't ask. They built a life instead. 2 kids, a small house, then the trailer when money got tight. The citation stayed in the chest, a ghost he didn't disturb. Back in 2025, Millersburg was changing. Ethan's videos had sparked a movement, small but stubborn. The diner's free coffee for veterans became a daily ritual, with old men in VFW caps swapping stories over steaming mugs. A group of high school students, inspired by Ethan, started a club called Veterans Voices, visiting the local VFW hall to record oral histories. Mrs. Callahan organized a weekly potluck for elderly neighbors, her rosebush now joined by a row of marigolds planted by kids from the community center. But the real shift came at the town council meeting a month after Frank's death. The room was packed, standing room only, with faces young and old. Ethan was there, the photo of Frank and Tommy tucked in his wallet. The council president, a retired pharmacist named Clara Hayes, called the meeting to order. The agenda was simple: what to do about Frank Merrill's legacy. Clara spoke first, her voice steady but heavy. We clapped for Frank at the parade. We pinned a badge on him and called it honor. But we didn't know him. Not really. She held up a copy of the Gazette article, its edges worn from being passed around. This isn't just about a park or a plaque. It's about making sure no one else slips through the cracks. A man in the back stood up, his VFW cap tilted slightly. I knew Frank, he said, his voice rough. Not well, but enough. He never talked about that medal, never wanted pity, but he deserved better than a trailer and a handshake once a year. The room murmured agreement, a low hum of shared shame. Ethan raised his hand, his heart pounding. Clara nodded at him. He stood, his voice shaky at first. I took a picture with him, he said, pulling out his phone to show the selfie. I called him a legend, but I didn't even ask his name. I found this in his trailer. He held up the photo of Frank and Tommy, his hands trembling. He saved this guy's life. Tommy Reed. I looked him up. He's still alive in Akron. I called him yesterday. The room went quiet. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. Tommy said Frank never told anyone what he did. Not his wife, not his kids. But Tommy's got a family now, kids, grandkids, because of Frank. I think we need to do something real, not just a park, something that lasts. The council voted unanimously to create the Frank Merrill Veterans Fund, a small grant program to help elderly veterans with home repairs, medical bills, or just a ride to the store. They also approved a memorial bench in the renamed park with a plaque that read, "For Frank Merrill, Navy Cross recipient, and all who serve in silence." Ethan volunteered to track down Tommy Reed and invite him to the unveiling. Tommy Reed was 76, a retired mechanic with a limp that never quite went away. When Ethan called, Tommy's voice cracked with something like relief. "I've been waiting 50 years to thank him properly," he said. He arrived in Millersburg a week later, his pickup truck rattling into town. Ethan met him at the diner, where the free coffee was now a point of pride. Tommy was shorter than Ethan expected, his face lined but kind, his eyes carrying the same weight Frank's had in the selfie. Walter Grayson stood at the edge of the stage, his cane lightly tapping the floor. His eyes, clouded by cataracts, saw only shadows, but he felt the weight of the room. 300 students, their murmurs like the distant rumble of artillery. At 78, Walter was lean, his posture stooped but unyielding, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and khakis, pressed out of habit. On his left forearm, barely visible under a rolled-up sleeve, an eagle and anchor tattoo peeked out, its ink blurred by time. In his pocket, a dog tag pressed against his thigh, a relic he carried not for show, but for memory. The principal, Mrs. Hargrove, had invited him to speak at the school's Veterans Day assembly, a last-minute replacement when a local congressman canceled. Walter hadn't wanted to come. He hadn't spoken publicly about the war, Vietnam, 1968, in decades. But Hargrove had been persistent, her voice kind but firm over the phone. "The kids need to hear from someone who was there," she'd said. Walter, never one for arguing, agreed, though he dreaded standing before a crowd that might not care. Now, waiting in the wings, he heard a teacher's sharp clap. "Quiet, everyone!" Her voice was strained, battling a wave of teenage indifference. Walter caught the creak of chairs, the rustle of backpacks, an occasional snicker. He gripped his cane tighter, the wood smooth under his calloused palm. He'd faced worse: mortar fire, jungle heat, the screams of men he couldn't save. But this felt different. Exposed. Maybe pointless. Mrs. Hargrove's heels clicked as she approached the microphone. "Good morning, students," she began, her tone polished but warm. "Today we honor those who've served our country. Our guest, Mr. Walter Grayson, is a Vietnam War veteran, a Marine who—" A sharp laugh cut her off, loud enough to echo. Walter's jaw tightened. He couldn't see the source, but he knew the sound. Boredom laced with mockery. Hargrove pressed on, unfazed. "Who served with courage and has graciously agreed to share his story. Please give him your respect and attention." The room quieted, but it was a grudging silence, broken by whispers and the tap of phones under desks. Walter stepped forward, guided by Hargrove's gentle touch on his elbow. The stage creaked under his weight, and he felt the spotlight's heat on his face. He stood at the podium, his cane resting against it, and cleared his throat. The microphone squealed briefly, drawing a few stifled laughs. "Good morning," Walter said, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. "I ain't much for speeches, never was, but they asked me to talk, so here I am." He paused, waiting for something, a reaction, a sign. Nothing came. Just the faint hum of the auditorium's old heating system and an occasional cough. He felt their eyes, or perhaps their absence, drifting to phones, to friends, to anything but him. He was invisible, just an old man in a room that didn't want him. The thought stung, sharper than he'd expected. He'd been ignored before, by VA clerks, waitresses who assumed he was just another retiree, a world that had moved on from his war. But this was different. These were kids, the ones he'd fought for, or at least for their parents' generation. And they didn't care. He started anyway. "I was 19 when I shipped out to Vietnam," he said. "Marine Corps, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Didn't know much about the world then. Didn't know much about anything except how to follow orders. A chair scraped loudly in the back. A girl's voice whispered, "This is so boring." Walter's hands tightened on the podium. He could walk off, leave them to their phones and chatter. No one would stop him. But he thought of Tommy. Tommy Delgado, his best friend, his brother in arms, gone 57 years now. Tommy, who never got to grow old, who never stood on a stage like this. Walter owed him more than walking away. "Let me tell you about a friend of mine," Walter said, his voice steadying. His name was Tommy Delgado. He was from El Paso, Texas. Loved baseball, loved his mama's tamales, loved telling bad jokes that'd make you groan. He was the kind of guy who'd give you his last cigarette, even if he was dying for a smoke. The room shifted slightly, a ripple of curiosity. Walter pressed on, his words slow but deliberate. "We were in the jungle near Quezon, summer of '68. Hot as hell, wet all the time, bugs eating you alive. Tommy and me, we were in the same squad. He was the point man, always walking ahead, checking for traps, for ambushes. Brave as anything, but he never acted like it. Just did his job." Walter's fingers brushed the dog tag in his pocket, its edges worn smooth. He didn't need to see it to know the name stamped there. Thomas R. Delgado, USMC. One day, he continued, "We're on patrol, moving through this valley. It's quiet. Too quiet, you know? Like the world's holding its breath. Tommy's up front, maybe 20 yards ahead. I'm watching his back, like always. Then it happens." He paused, the memory sharp as a blade. The crack of gunfire, the thud of mortars, the earth screaming. "Ambush," he said simply. "They hit us hard. North Vietnamese, dug in deep. Bullets flying, explosions everywhere. Tommy, he's yelling for us to get down, but he's still out there, still moving, trying to spot where they're firing from. He was always like that. Thinking of us first." Walter's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I saw him go down," he said, "shot in the chest. I ran to him, dragged him behind a tree. He was bleeding bad, but he's still talking, telling me to get out, to leave him. Like I'd ever do that." His throat tightened, but he pushed through. "I held him, tried to stop the bleeding. He looked at me, and you know what he said? 'Tell my mom I did good.' That was it. Then he was gone." The room was silent now, and the kind that presses on your chest. Walter felt it, even blind. He straightened, his shoulders squaring like they had in his dress blues decades ago. Tommy Delgado was 20 years old when he died. He didn't get to come home, didn't get to grow old, didn't get to stand here and tell you this himself. So I'm doing it for him. A boy in the front row shifted, his phone forgotten on his lap. A girl near the aisle leaned forward, her eyes wide. Walter couldn't see them, but he felt the change, like a tide turning. He wasn't done yet. "I carried his dog tag out of that jungle," Walter said, pulling it from his pocket and holding it up. The metal glinted under the stage lights, a small, battered thing that carried a man's life. "This is all I've got left of him. But it's enough to remind me what he stood for. What we all stood for. Duty, honor, each other." He paused, letting the words settle. "You kids, you've got your whole lives ahead. You've got phones, games, dreams bigger than anything I ever had. And that's good. That's what we fought for. But don't forget the ones who made it possible. The ones who didn't come back. The ones who gave everything so you could sit here, free, bored, alive." The silence held, heavy and unbroken. Then, from the back, a single clap. Another joined it, then another, until the room erupted in applause. Not wild, not forced, but steady, respectful. Walter stood still, his cane steady against the podium, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything. Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward, her voice thick. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. That was, powerful." She turned to the students. "I hope you all take a moment to reflect on what we've heard today." As the applause faded, a boy stood up in the third row. He was lanky, maybe 16, with a Letterman jacket slung over his chair. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm sorry we weren't listening at first. That was wrong. What you said means something. Thank you. For Tommy, too. Walter nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. Appreciate that, son, he said quietly. Means more than you know. Another student stood, a girl with braided hair and a notebook clutched to her chest. My grandpa was in Vietnam, she said. He doesn't talk about it much, but I'm going to ask him now. Because of you. One by one, others rose. A boy in a hoodie, a girl with a cheerleader's pin, a quiet kid who hadn't spoken all semester. They didn't say much, just small words of thanks, of connection. Walter listened, his sightless eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, his heart heavy with something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. Then came the moment that changed everything. A man in the back, unnoticed until now, stood. He was in his 40s, dressed in a crisp Marine Corps uniform, captain's bars gleaming on his collar. He'd slipped in late, standing quietly by the door. Now he walked forward, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The students turned, the room falling silent again. Mr. Grayson, the captain said, his voice clear and strong, I'm Captain Daniel Ruiz, 2nd Marine Division. I was in the back listening. Your story, Tommy's story, hit me hard. I lost men in Afghanistan, good men. I know what it means to carry their names. He stopped at the edge of the stage, standing at attention. Then, slowly, he raised his hand in a salute, sharp and unwavering. On behalf of the Corps, and for Tommy Delgado, Semper Fi, sir. Walter's breath caught. He couldn't see the salute, but he felt it, like a current running through him. He straightened, his old Marine instincts kicking in, and returned the salute, his hand steady, despite the years. Semper Fi, he whispered. The room was still, every eye on the two men, one old, one younger, bound by something bigger than themselves. Then Captain Ruiz turned to the students. This man, he said, pointing to Walter, is why we serve. He carried his brother's memory for 57 years. That's what honor looks like. Don't forget it. The applause came again, louder this time, but Walter barely heard it. He was thinking of Tommy, of the jungle, of the promise he'd kept. He felt Hargrove's hand on his arm, guiding him off the stage, but before he left, he heard the captain's voice again, addressing the crowd. I want to propose something, Ruiz said. This school needs a way to remember men like Tommy Delgado. I'm going to work with Mrs. Hargrove to start a scholarship in his name. For students who show the kind of courage and loyalty Mr. Grayson talked about. Who's with me? Hands shot up, voices rising in agreement. Walter paused at the stage's edge, his cane still, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He hadn't come here to change anything, just to tell a story. But maybe, just maybe, Tommy's name would live on a little longer. 3 months had passed since Walter Grayson stood on the stage in Willow Creek, holding Tommy Delgado's dog tag before 300 students. That day left a mark on the town, like a stone tossed into a still lake. Ripples spread, but the water soon settled. Winter had come to Virginia, bringing a cold wind that howled through the bare branches of maples along Patriot Street. The flag near the school still fluttered, but its sound was drowned out by the rumble of school buses and children's laughter. Life moved on. The Tommy Delgado Scholarship became a reality faster than anyone expected. Captain Daniel Ruiz, true to his promise, worked with Mrs. Hargrove and the local Veterans Association to raise funds. Students joined in, organizing bake sales, selling cookies and T-shirts with Semper Fi and an eagle silhouette. The local diner, Dixie Diner, donated a percentage of its monthly sales, and the bank on Main Street provided a starting grant. By January, the scholarship was official, a $2,000 annual award for a Willow Creek student who demonstrated courage, loyalty, and community dedication. A plaque appeared on the school's honor board, Tommy Delgado's name engraved in gold letters, beneath it, in honor of those who gave all. But Walter, his name wasn't on the plaque, and as often happens, the man who sparked it all began to fade from conversations. At first, he was mentioned often, in the school newspaper, in local X-chats, even in the pastor's Sunday sermon. That blind veteran, people said, nodding respectfully. But over time, his name blurred, replaced by a vague, that old Marine, or simply, the veteran. The students who'd applauded him returned to their lives, exams, football games, prom planning. Captain Ruiz went back to his unit at Camp Lejeune, his letters to Hargrove growing infrequent. Mrs. Hargrove, swamped with school duties, rarely mentioned Walter, though she felt a twinge of guilt when she passed the plaque. Walter felt it. He wasn't one to crave attention, but the silence hurt. He lived on the edge of Willow Creek in a small house that smelled of old wood and the coffee he brewed each morning. His days were quiet, a radio tuned to classical music, the creak of his rocking chair, monthly calls from a social worker. Tommy's dog tag sat on the nightstand by his bed, next to a yellowed letter from Tommy's mother, dated 1969. Walter hadn't read it in years, couldn't, even if his eyes allowed, but he knew every word by heart. Thank you for being with my boy until the end. One February morning, as snow dusted the sidewalks, Walter decided to walk to Dixie Diner. He rarely went out, but that day the cold felt less biting, the loneliness heavier. His cane tapped along the cobblestone, echoing in the quiet street. Inside the diner, the air smelled of fried bacon and syrup, a radio playing country tunes. Walter took his usual spot at the counter by the window, where he could feel the sun's warmth, even if he couldn't see it. The waitress, a young girl named Kayla, poured him coffee without asking. "How you doing, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice light but distant. She hadn't been at the school assembly, but had heard about the veteran who moved everyone. Walter smiled, his fingers wrapping around the warm mug. "Not bad, Kayla. You?" She mumbled something about school and moved to another customer. Walter listened as the diner buzzed around him, the clink of dishes, laughter, snippets of talk about the weather and a basketball game. No one mentioned the scholarship. No one mentioned Tommy. And of course, no one mentioned Walter. He wasn't bitter. Not exactly. He knew how the world worked. People move forward, memories fade. But there was a part of him, small but stubborn, that wanted someone to remember. Not for himself, but for Tommy. For all the boys whose names never made it onto plaques. That same week, the school prepared for the first Tommy Delgado scholarship ceremony. The auditorium was decked with red and blue ribbons, a podium bearing the Marine Corps emblem. Students buzzed with excitement, but not for the scholarship. For most, it was just another event, a chance to skip class. The first award was set to go to Emily Rodriguez, the girl with braids who'd promised to ask her grandpa about Vietnam after Walter's speech. She'd organized a volunteer project to support veterans at a local shelter, and the committee unanimously chose her. Walter had been invited to the ceremony, but the invitation arrived late, lost in his mailbox under a pile of junk flyers. Mrs. Hargrove meant to call, but was sidetracked by school chaos, budget reports, parent meetings. Walter only learned of the event a day prior, when Kayla at the diner mentioned her younger brother preparing for some ceremony at school. "Something about a veteran, I think," she said, unaware Walter was that veteran. He decided to go, not for recognition, but because it was for Tommy. On the day of the ceremony, he wore his old Marine jacket, faded but clean, with a barely visible 3rd Battalion patch. His cane tapped along the sidewalk as he walked to the school, the frosty air nipping at his cheeks. The school lobby smelled of floor wax and paper decorations. He heard the hum of students, the creak of chairs, muffled laughter. No one greeted him, no one recognized him. He found a seat in the back row, his cane resting quietly by his feet. The ceremony began with the national anthem, sung by the school choir. Mrs. Hargrove gave a speech, praising Emily and her project. She mentioned Tommy Delgado, calling him a hero whose sacrifice inspires us. Not a word about Walter. Emily took the stage, her braids swaying as she accepted a certificate and a small medallion engraved with Tommy's name. The room applauded, cameras clicked. Walter sat quietly, his fingers gripping the dog tag in his pocket. He felt no bitterness, just a kind of emptiness. The scholarship was the right thing, but it felt detached from him, from the reality of what he'd lived through. He thought of the letter from Tommy's mother, her words, "You were his brother." Did anyone remember that he was the one who brought Tommy's story to this room? As the ceremony ended, Walter stood to leave, his cane tapping softly. But then he heard a voice, young, hesitant, but familiar. "Mr. Grayson?" It was Emily. She stood before him, holding the medallion, Her eyes glistened as if fighting tears. I, I didn't know you were here. Why weren't you invited on stage? Walter smiled, his wrinkles deepening. Doesn't matter, girl. This ain't about me, it's about Tommy. She shook her head. No, that's not right. You told us about him. Without you, none of this would have happened. She turned to the room where students were still milling, packing backpacks. Wait here, she said, and ran to Hargrove. Minutes later, Mrs. Hargrove approached, her face flushed with shame. Walter, I'm so sorry. I should have called, made sure you were honored. That's on me. Walter raised a hand. It's all right, ma'am. I came for Tommy, not myself. But Emily wouldn't let it go. She returned to the stage, grabbing the microphone without permission. Attention, everyone. Her voice trembled but held strong. There's something we forgot to do today. Mr. Grayson is here in the back row. He's the one who told us about Tommy Delgado. Without him, there'd be no scholarship, and we forgot about him. The room fell silent. Students turned searching for Walter. He stood, his figure distinct against the dim light. Emily continued, My grandpa told me about Vietnam after I heard Mr. Grayson's story. He said people like Mr. Grayson didn't just fight. They carried their friends in their hearts their whole lives. We need to honor him. She stepped off the stage, holding the medallion, and approached Walter. This is for you, she said, placing it in his palm. From all of us. And from Tommy. Walter felt the cold metal, his fingers trembling. He couldn't see Emily's face, but he heard her voice, earnest and firm. The room erupted in applause, this time not for the scholarship, but for him. He heard someone shout, Thank you, Mr. Grayson! Others joined, their voices blending into a warm hum. Mrs. Hargrove took the microphone. Emily's right, she said. We owe Mr. Grayson more than we can say. I propose we add his name to the scholarship plaque as the keeper of Tommy Delgado's memory. The students cheered in agreement. Walter stood, his blind eyes feeling the crowd's warmth. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his hand clutching the medallion. In his pocket was the letter from Tommy's mother, and for a moment he thought he heard her voice, You were his brother. That evening, when Walter returned home, he placed the medallion on the nightstand beside the dog tag and the letter. He sat in his rocking chair, listening to the radio softly playing Debussy's Clair de Lune. Willow Creek had changed, if only a little. Students began volunteering at the Veterans Center, inspired by Emily. The school planned an annual Remembrance Day for veterans to share their stories. And the plaque in the lobby, soon to be updated, would bear two names, Tommy Delgado and Walter Grayson. Walter smiled to himself, his fingers brushing the dog tag. We did it, Tommy, he whispered. For the first time in years, he felt his burden lighten.